Greg, your mic.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Sorry. Okay, let's pray. Dear God, as always, we ask your help tonight. It's a hot evening. People come out through the hot weather, busy and distracted from work or from school or from home or wherever they come from. And tonight, I had some problems with my computer getting started, and all the things that can distract us from you, Lord, will happen. We ask your help to set these things aside. Please be among us, Lord, and please be in us. Please prepare our hearts and minds for what we're about to read. We pray that you'll be our teacher and our protector from mistakes and understanding and our guide into every truth. And we pray, Lord, the time that we spend here will be pleasing to you and that you'll use it to change us, to improve us in ways that you want us to grow. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So welcome, everybody. Grant, welcome. You're brand new, I think. So.
Sorry I was late.
Anybody else brand new? No? This class is studying the minor prophets, which are the last 12 books in the Old Testament. The 11th one of those, Zechariah, is the one that we're studying presently. Last week we were in chapter 10. Tonight we're going to cover chapter 11. Chapter 11 of Zechariah is a challenging chapter. It has been challenging for people who translated it out of Hebrew down through the centuries. It's been challenging for expositors, people who have taught this book over the centuries. And I think that because it's a little bit challenging to understand right, it's particularly important that we take advantage of the context that we already have. So that's the way you're supposed to read the Bible. If there's a part that's hard to understand, you're supposed to look at the parts that you do understand for help in understanding the confusing bits. And so tonight I'm going to start with a significant introduction just to remind us of the time that this work was written and the context of things that we've already studied. I won't try to cover everything we've studied before, but I do want to try to grab the pieces that may actually help us to understand chapter 11. So please be patient. Those of you who have been here every week and those of you who are just coming, maybe this will be great for you because the review may actually help you more. All right, so first some historical context, and now I want a rather broad historical context. So I remind you, that the history of Israel, however you count the beginning, whether it was when they came out of Egypt with Moses or further back, that whole early history of Israel culminates and it peaks with the establishing of Jerusalem as the capital in the Promised Land and the building of the first temple. Solomon, son of King David, was the guy who built that. They often call it Solomon's temple. And that was approximately 950 BC when that happened. So in some ways, I think it's fair to say that the peak in the history of Israel so far was the building of that first temple 950 years before Christ. Within less than 400 years after they built that first temple, everything had come tumbling down. The time of Solomon, the kingdom was divided into the northern kingdom called Israel and the southern kingdom called Judah. The northern kingdom was swept away by Assyria. The southern kingdom had various problems, ending in the exile to Babylon of its leaders and many of its people. So in 586 BC, Jerusalem fell and the temple was pulled down. When Zechariah writes, he tells us in the book itself that he's writing in a year which we reckon by our calendar to be 520 BC. And that's pretty much at a low point in the history of Israel, although things are just starting to turn up the main improvement has been that they've been allowed to leave captivity in Babylon to start to come back to Jerusalem. So Zechariah is among that first group of people who are coming back into Jerusalem. And the visions sent to Zechariah are sent in this point in history that's up on the slide. I want you to be reminded. The vision that comes to him is mostly encouraging. It's intended to encourage the people, to encourage them to rebuild the temple, to encourage them to reestablish their relationship with God, to renew the covenant, to point them forward to a better future than the place where they find themselves at 520 BC. And we know, in fact, that they do rebuild the second temple. About 4 years after Zechariah starts his prophecy, the second temple was dedicated. Most historians say around 516 BC. And the things that Zechariah says, as I said, are hopeful and encouraging, and some of the prophecies have been fulfilled. For example, he was encouraged and told to build, and it was foreseen that they would rebuild the second temple, and that happened, actually, which gave people confidence, I would imagine, in the rest of the prophecy that Zechariah delivered. But many of the things that Zechariah prophesied haven't happened yet. They're looking all the way out to the end of time when God will establish the heavenly Jerusalem and his perfect kingdom. And those things haven't happened yet, even in our time. And so that's the overall historical context. The prophet is speaking from that point. And we happen to know, because we're looking back on this from history, that Jerusalem fell again in 70 AD. This time the Romans pulled it down. They pulled the temple down. That was a temple that had been rebuilt and finally sort of refurbished and really made grand by King Herod. Herod's temple was pulled down in 70 AD, and to this very day, there is no temple in Jerusalem. Right? And so clearly a lot of the prophecy that we've read is looking so far out that it hasn't even happened yet in our time. Okay. So that's the historical context. Just keep it in mind, because I'm looking for things that will help us to understand chapter 11. And the history does help us a bit to understand chapter 11 when we study it here in a second. And the other thing that we have that we can use to help us understand chapter 11 is the overall structure of the text. So Zechariah, as I said before, is the 11th of the 12 minor prophets. We studied a bunch of the other minor prophets already. But in Zechariah, as I pointed out a few times, just based on literary form and style, almost everybody can see that there are two main parts of Zechariah. The first part, consisting of chapters 1 through 8, is one thing, and the second part, consisting of chapters 9 through 14 rather, is another thing. And we've wondered, and other people have wondered down through the centuries, what's the relationship between the first half and the second half, and what's the best way to understand it. We've talked about that some in this class. But as of today, as I've continued to reflect on this, I would describe it a little bit this way, is chapters 1 through 8 are almost all hopeful, as I've said before. They're encouraging. They're looking from the sins of the fathers, which they're urged not to repeat, all the way out to when God completes his perfect plan. And they're intended to encourage these people to rebuild the temple and to persevere. Christians can't help but notice glimpses of Jesus even in the first 8 chapters of Zechariah, because there are a couple places where clearly that's what the prophet is talking about. But glimpses of Jesus are even more pronounced in the second part of Zechariah. Matthew and John and other New Testament authors quote rather frequently from part 2 of Zechariah, because they're seeing Jesus prophesied there. And that may be because the second part, rather than looking all the way out to the perfection of God's plan at the end of history, part 2 may be looking a little, not quite all the way out. It may be looking out to the troubles that need to come through and to the king who will come to lead people through these troubles and to establish the perfect kingdom. And so the Messiah is a little bit more in view, I think, in part 2. Okay. He's the one who's going to come to lead them through some more problems that are coming. And so the second part consists of 2 oracles, as we've said before. Chapters 9 through 11 are 1 oracle. Oracle meaning more than just prophecy somehow, but an authoritative pronouncement about what will happen in the future. You consult the oracle of God to see what will happen. There are 2 of them in part 2. The first one, chapters 9, 10, and 11. The second one, chapters 12, 13, and 14. Tonight, chapter 11 then completes the first of the 2 oracles, which in turn make up the second part of Zechariah. Okay. So we can understand chapter 11 within this larger context. We know the whole background from chapters 1 through 8, and we know, and I'll review in a bit more detail, what's been said in chapters 9 and 10 before we pick up our study of chapter 11 here in a few minutes. Be patient a little while longer. I'll be done reviewing soon. So that's the overall structure of Zechariah, the book. Now let me look at just a tiny little bit of detail. So this slide that I have up now is a 1-slide summary of the first 8 chapters, the first part 1 of Zechariah. Here's some of the key points that we've studied in this class. So for those of you who have been here every night, this is just review. For others, it might be new. The first 6 verses of part 1 talk about the sins of the fathers. Zechariah comes right out of the box as prophecy says, remember the fathers, remember how they sinned, remember how I sent prophets to them and they ignored the prophets, and therefore, because they wouldn't listen to me, God says through the prophet, I didn't listen to them. All of the problems that they have now coming back from Babylon, the destruction of their kingdom, the small population and all the rest, are problems that came about because their fathers disobeyed God and turned away from God. And so God, through the prophet, warns them not to repeat those mistakes. And that note is sounded throughout the Bible. If you're reading your Bible, you'll notice the Holy Spirit through the Bible in Old Testament and New Testament, various places, is reminding us as it was reminding them. Look at history and don't do that. Human history is teaching us more about what we shouldn't do in the future than about what we should do, spiritually speaking. Then, after having touched on the sins of the fathers, starting in verse 7 of chapter 1 and continuing until verse 8 of chapter 6, Zechariah has a series of visions that happen at night, all of them on the same night, seemingly. They're called the 8 night visions. And these show us pictures, rather mysterious pictures of God's eternal plan, which is taking the people all the way from the sins of the fathers out to this perfect heavenly Jerusalem, where not only Judah and Israel, but all of the nations are somehow drawn together and God lives among the people, and the people are forgiven and cleansed of all unrighteousness. This is what we all look forward to also as Christians. This is the common expectation of Christians and Jews, where history will end. It's the direction of God's history, the destination of history. And again, that's a theme that we see at various places in the Bible, from the beginning to the end, Old Testament and New Testament. The Bible is telling us about the history of God's working, and it's a straight line, not a circle, as I keep saying. Christianity isn't a religion that moves in cycles. God is moving in a line from where he started to where he's ending. And he's telling us some things about what he's doing so that we can have hope and we can keep moving and persevere and wait for what God has promised. The 8 night visions then give us that sort of deep background into God's activity, past, present, and future. And then the 8 night visions actually end at verse 8 in chapter 6, but there's a few more verses, 9 through 15 in chapter 6, where we get a very important, what I call enacted prophecy. It means that they're not in a vision anymore, but God says to the prophet, go get these guys. That must be rich guys. He says, take some silver and gold from them, make a crown, then take this crown that you guys make and put it on the head of Joshua the high priest and say to him, behold, my servant the branch. It's enacted prophecy. There's a little play that God is having them act out so that before their eyes, in the presence of this high priest who now has a king's crown on his head, the people see a picture of the Messiah who will come. And then God tells them, now take the crown off his head and put it in the temple as a reminder, as a sign or symbol that reminds you of the coming king who is a priest. right? The one who will come to usher in this perfect kingdom, I dare say. All right, and then that ends sort of this whole series of visions and prophetic utterances that give us this good grounding in God's eternal plans and purposes, all in with the final word, which is, we know as Christians, Christ, the one who steps into that throne, who is priest and he's king and savior, Messiah and Lord. That's who they see there. Then the last two chapters of this first main part, the first 8 chapters are the first part of Zechariah. The last two chapters are a little bit different. They sort of bring us now back to the present day. In chapter 7, Zechariah is now telling us about something that actually happens in his day. Some guys come in from out of town and they ask some questions about worship practices. Do we have to continue observing all of these fasts and things that we've been doing to commemorate all the bad things that happened when we're exiled from Israel, from Jerusalem? Now that we're coming back, can we stop that? And the prophet, God through the prophet, takes it as an opportunity to lecture the people a bit by saying that's not what God cares about. What God cares about is whether there's justice and there's mercy. How do you treat one another? How do you love others and me? Which is the same message that Jesus delivers in the Sermon on the Mount. And again, the pattern of the whole Bible is always telling people God doesn't care so much about our detailed worship practices or elements of religion. He cares about the human heart and our relationship with each other and our relationship with him. The fact that they have to be lectured on that in chapter 7, they're also lectured in chapter 7 about having turned back to idolatry and sorcery and some of that kind of stuff, tells us that despite all the wonderful things we've seen in those first 6 chapters about what God is up to, the people are just as sinful as ever. Okay. As sinful as we still are. People haven't changed much in human history, and we get the sense that they haven't changed on the eve of the construction of the Second Temple either. Nevertheless, chapter 8, which ends that first main part, is a promise renewed of the peace and prosperity that God promises that he is finally going to deliver. And I get the feeling in chapter 8, he's not just looking out to that perfect future that we see in the first 6 chapters, but even a little closer to home. He's saying, look, you guys, take heart. Rebuild the Second Temple. Jerusalem's going to clean up. Israel's going to clean up. You know, there are centuries to come where children will play in the streets and old people will walk on their canes, he says. Things are coming back now. All right? They're back from Babylon, and things will be better. Not just in the far future, but in the near future as well. So then, as I said, that's all my quick review of the whole first 8 chapters. And I have to say that although there's bits in there that are warning and admonition, you know, to the people about their sin, vastly those 8 chapters are encouraging to Zechariah and his contemporaries, and also to you and me, because what they're saying is God has a plan, and it ends up really good for the people that will stick with God. All right. Then we move into the second main half of Zechariah, as I said before, chapters 9 through 14, which are outlined here in a bit more detail. So chapter 9 begins, as we saw week before last. Chapter 9 begins speaking of the defeat of the enemies of Judah and of the coming of the king, who's described as riding on a donkey, at the Prince of Peace, the Savior of his people. This is an image which Matthew and John and New Testament authors in which they recognize Jesus. Jesus himself sort of reenacted some of that or lived what's prophesied here in his lifetime, riding into Jerusalem on a donkey and so forth. So chapter 9 is saying to the people, you still have enemies. Okay, in the 5th century BC, these people still have a lot of rough history they're going to have to live through. They still have enemies. And Syria's gone, Babylon's gone. But the Persians and the Macedonians and the Romans and Nazi Germany and a whole bunch of other bad things are coming, right? They're not finished with the difficult history of Israel. And verse 9 reassures them that at least in the near term, that God is with them, that their enemies will be overturned, that the king is coming to save his people. And then chapter 10, as we saw last week, begins with another quick indictment of the sins of the people. God expresses his anger towards especially the leaders of the people, and he says he's going to punish the leaders of the people. And I think he's talking about the leaders in those days. I mean, at the time of Zechariah and soon thereafter. The problems of the fathers haven't gone away. There's problems still with the people who lead the nation, and God is angry with them, and he's going to do something about it. But still, at the end of chapter 10, he reiterates his intention to perfect the people, to bless the people, and to reunify the people. Remember, he says he's going to whistle, and the people are going to come back from all the places that they've been scattered to. And not just Judah, but also, he says, the children of Joseph, which means the northern kingdom will be called back somehow also in the end. A similar sentiment to Hosea and other prophets, that God at the end of time, we saw this in the first 8 chapters, we see it again in 9 and 10, is God is finally going to bring everything to a perfect conclusion, no matter how tough it may seem in the parts that we live through and that they live through, all right? And then tonight, chapter 11, and this is what I wanted you to see, is where chapter 11 sits within this whole context, is the conclusion of this first oracle, which is the first of 2 oracles in the second half of Zechariah. And we've got a lot of understanding about what God is doing from this prophet, and of course other prophets that we've read. And most of it's rather helpful and encouraging. Okay, so we have this broad, rather helpful and encouraging background. And now chapter 11 sitting in front of it's going to look rather different. And we want to see it against the broad, hopeful background. All right, so let's now just go ahead on into chapter 11. It won't take that long probably to go through chapter 11, but hopefully we won't have trouble to understand it too much. Let me just say, last week somebody pointed out that they were reading a translation different than the one that we're using in class, and our translations referred to leaders and their translation referred to male goats. Those are 2 perfectly acceptable modern translations translated rather differently. And one of the things that you'll notice in the parts of the Bible that are really difficult, translators will vary more than they do in other parts of the Bible where it's less difficult. The translators struggle to take this out of Hebrew into understandable English or Japanese or whatever language they're translating into. And when you see translators differ, it means they're struggling to get it right. And so it'll pay to look at a few different translations, particularly in books where there's a lot of difficulty in understanding. You'll see that different people may have different suggestions to you about how to read it. All right, so the first 3 verses of chapter 11, let me just start out by reading them. Zechariah chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. In the English Standard Version, I'm reading. Open your doors, O Lebanon, that the fire may devour your cedars. Wail, O Cypress, for the cedar has fallen, for the glorious trees are ruined. Wail, oaks of Bashan, for the thick forest has been felled. The sound of the wail of the shepherds, for their glory is ruined. The sound of the roar of the lions, for the thicket of the Jordan is ruined. All right, so set against this, not completely, but mainly hopeful background that I reviewed before starting tonight's lesson, we get this poetic image, and it's an image of destruction and dismay. All right, it talks about wailing. It talks about ruin. It talks about fire. It talks about deforestation. It talks about loss of glory. All right, the trees are cut down. The thicket of the Jordan is a ruin. All right. This is a very different kind of a place that the prophet has brought us to. And I put this picture up here as a picture of a forest that's kind of on fire. And I just want to keep that picture in front of our face because it is a sort of a vision of the sentiment expressed in those first 3 verses. And you might think, or somebody might try to simplify their teaching by saying, well, this just begins a whole new thing. You know, chapter 10 was finished with chapter 10, and now chapter 11 is something else. But this is not disconnected from what went before. Not only does the same poetic style continue from the end of chapter 11 and through the first 3 or 4 verses of the end of chapter 10 and through the first 3 verses of chapter 11, But you can see here that the imagery is connected. So it talks about Lebanon and Bashan, which are geographically the same or connected with Gilead and Lebanon. In chapter 10, verse 10, we read last week, which is where God said he would whistle and bring the people back from the diaspora. He said, I'll whistle and the people will come back from the sons of Joseph, meaning the northern kingdom, and the tribes of Judah. They're going to come back in the end when God reconciles everything. The place he's bringing them back to is basically the same place that's on fire now at the beginning of chapter 11. And so I don't think the mind of the poet, prophet, vision here has drifted to a whole new thing. It's growing out of the old thing. We don't forget the hopeful background, but we see that at 520, now 522 BC, when the prophet is speaking, or perhaps a little bit later, 518 BC, it's 2 years later since Zechariah started talking in 520 BC, they still can see that there's a lot of difficult stuff ahead. They're still in a difficult place, and with prophetic vision, they can see a whole bunch of difficulty remains to be gotten through. Okay, difficult things are going to happen, and if you remember at the end of chapter 10, it spoke there about God coming through a sea of troubles, okay, in order to deliver the beautiful promise that's made there. We hear about the King who's coming, even Christ, who's going to come to conquer enemies and to restore things. And so there's a lot of opposition left that God's going to work through before he gets to the end. And so I think there we had, God coming through the sea of difficulties and smashing down the waves is one metaphor for coming trouble. Here the fire and the destruction of the forest and all of that is another metaphor for troubles to be gotten through. And you ask yourself, you look at this picture of a world on fire, their land on fire, a land that's going to be blessed in the future according to previous prophecy. And you ask yourself, is this a picture of God's anger against the bad leaders that he says he's very angry against? He's been saying that off and on. He's very angry at the shepherds that are leading the people astray. Is it a picture of his anger against the shepherds? Do the trees, for example, and the cedars of Lebanon or the fir trees and cypress, do those represent the leaders that God is angry with that he's going to burn up? Or is it a picture of God's anger against the continuing sins of the people? Because at several points we've been reminded in the prophecy that while God is going to fix everything in the end, the people are still as sinful as ever, and God is angry. Is it a picture of God's anger against the people? Or is it simply a picture of the trouble which Judah and Israel have to pass through, like they were talking at the end of chapter 10, before they can realize the blessing of and unity which has been prophesied for them? And I can tell you that different readers across many centuries have seen all of those things here. Okay. It's not a question of conservative or liberal or good or bad interpreters. Great interpreters in the history of the church look at this picture of destruction here and wonder, I wonder what the vision of the prophet is communicating here. And it may be, I've named it, or you had a different idea, or it may be some combination of those things. But clearly, it's difficult. It's not a happy time that's pictured here. The history of Israel between the day of Zechariah and the final perfect kingdom that we've seen in his visions has a bunch of difficult periods remaining yet to be gotten through. And so this is kind of like, there's a fancy term you hear used sometimes called over-realized eschatology, which means that God says what's going to happen in the end, and some of it's already happened. But sometimes people get ahead of themselves, and they think they're closer to the end than they really are. You read a hopeful prophecy and everything is great, and you thought, well, that's now. But it's not now. It's already, but it's not yet. Like I was talking last week, you can see it. It's promised. The prophets can see it. God has said it, so it will certainly happen, but we don't live there yet. We live at this point in history, not that point in history. And so we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Okay. An example that has significance for our life is sometimes we read about the forgiveness for sins that we have in Jesus Christ, and we get ahead of ourselves and we think we can do anything. Paul was teaching us actively that we're not supposed to think that way. Just because Christ went to the cross and died as an atonement for our sin doesn't mean we're allowed to sin more. We're not perfect yet. Yes, the Holy Spirit's at work in us, making us better, and hopefully you'll see improvement in our life, but we're still desperately sinful. And we'll be desperately sinful on the day we die. None of us is going to be perfect before we die. If we start thinking that way, we've over-realized the promise of God too soon. We got ahead of ourselves. We have to have faith in what God will finally accomplish without tricking ourselves into thinking that it's all here already. Right? And so this picture may be just reminding the people using words. This is a picture summarizing the words of verses 1 through 3. Yes, a lot of good stuff is happening to you guys, but be ready for some more difficulty yet to come. Another warning that may be here is this is the kind of stuff they're going to suffer through if they won't follow the good shepherd that the Lord sends them. God keeps sending them shepherds. He sent them Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He sent them Moses. He sent them all the prophets we've been reading. And it hasn't made them permanently better. They keep going astray and going astray and going astray. Finally, he sent his son Jesus. And what happens? People kill him and go astray and go astray and go astray. And so God's anger is still out there for those who won't turn and follow the shepherds that he sends to them. Especially if you won't turn and follow his son Jesus, there's no place to hide from the wrath of God. It all remains on you, as Paul teaches in Romans and elsewhere. Right. So maybe that's a picture of the sin to which everyone's exposed if you won't stay with the shepherds that God sends. I don't know. Think about that. Then in verse 4 of chapter 11, we read, "Thus said the Lord my God, become shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter." So now I have a picture up here of sheep in the foreground and the fire in the background, just to visually communicate the thought that the sheep, which are the children of Israel who are in view here, almost certainly, who are doomed to slaughter, are at risk of that fire that we saw in the early verses of this chapter. I think the Lord, when it says, "Thus says the Lord my God," is suggesting a cause and effect relationship between the image of destruction I had up before and the reason for God saying this to Zechariah. Right? He said about the wailing and the destruction and all of that. Then verse 4 says, "Thus says the Lord my God." In other words, therefore, because of that, this. The reason why I'm saying this to you, Zechariah, is because of that thing that we just talked about. All right? And he says the prophet should become the shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter. I'm going to ask you some questions. Does he mean that Zechariah should literally become part of the leadership of the nation at that point in history? He is a prophet in Israel. We've already seen when the out-of-town visitors came asking about worship practices and stuff, they came to talk not just to the priests, but to the prophets. So it's possible that when God says to Zechariah that he should become a shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter, he means he's actually supposed to assume some real life leadership position in the nation of Israel at that time. Or does he mean that he should, in some sense, tell this prophecy while acting it out like a shepherd? Like we saw, for example, before, the enacted prophecy of my servant the branch, where they actually crowned the high priest and used him as a figure of the Messiah who would come. And it's not uncommon in the Bible for prophets to act out prophecy rather than just to say or to write. There are any number of examples of that. So some people think Zechariah is being acted to play the role of the shepherd as he pronounces the prophecy to the people. Or does he mean, like the visions we saw in the first 6 verses, in a sort of prophetic vision that Zechariah is supposed to imagine himself as being a shepherd of the people, so that he's standing in that role as God continues to speak to him and about him. And once again, good, different readers of the Bible down through the centuries have read it in those 3 ways and other ways besides. And I'm going to take the approach, just because it would be too confusing to jump around. I actually think it doesn't matter. You can read it in any one of those ways and you're going to get the same point in the end. But the way I'm going to think about it is the visionary way. God is saying to Zechariah, envision yourself as being the good shepherd of the people as I continue to prophesy. Okay, see yourself as this shepherd appointed by God to care for the people as we continue to talk about this subject. Okay. Assume this role as I continue speaking to you. And like I said, I don't think it matters if he actually does it in real life or if he imagines it or if he acts it out. God's speech will be saying the same thing, really, to us. Because what God wants to talk about is the relationship between a shepherd appointed by God and the people. So verses 5 through 6 read this one. Those who buy them slaughter them and go unpunished. And those who sell them say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord, I have become rich." And their own shepherds have no pity on them. Verse 6. For I will no longer have pity on the inhabitants of this land, declares the Lord. Behold, I will cause each of them to fall into the hand of his neighbor, and each into the hand of his king, and they shall crush the land, and I will deliver none of them. I will deliver none from their hand. So God is speaking, all right? The first 4 verses of chapter 11 represent this threat against the people as fire and deforestation and ruin of their environment. Their existence, in other words, is threatened by something. Okay. And now the situation is equally threatening, but a different metaphor is being used. We've set the fire and destruction away, and now we're talking about this is a sheep auction in real life, but it serves my purpose for this prophecy. Right? So the people are described as a flock of sheep who are headed for destruction, headed for slaughter, headed to be killed by people. The people who buy the sheep slaughter them, and yet there's no punishment for them, the prophet says. The people who sell the sheep, God's people, become rich, and then they dare to thank God for their riches as if it was God who thought of their evil. This is the kind of a common tendency human beings have, right? People get rich, and then they thank God as if God is blessing them because they're rich, when in point of fact they might be just as evil as the day is long. Evil people get rich too. Sometimes evil people get more rich. The fact that you're rich doesn't mean God is on your side. It could mean the opposite, right? But these people are actually destroying God's people, enriching themselves in the process, and then daring to say, praise God, as if God is blessing them in what they do, even though they're enemies of God and his people. And we've seen in the prophets a lot that we've been studying this class. The minor prophets spend a lot of time. God is really angry when leaders cheat people and ignore poor people and ignore widows and orphans and all of that, or don't practice justice correctly. God cares about his sheep, and he's really angry when the leaders victimize them. Okay, so here he's saying the sheep themselves are helpless, and he says their own shepherds have no pity on them. He says, I just read that. He says, the latter part of verse 5 says, and their own shepherds have no pity on them. So the leaders of the people, whether they're the high priests or the business leaders or the people in civil government or the judges, all the prophets have been against all these people throughout the minor prophets. Whoever they are, those people don't care about, those leaders don't care about the people, which is why the sheep are in trouble. But that situation is dangerous to the people because not only that, but here it says that God no longer has pity on them either. And this is a more difficult concept. If you look in verse 6, God says, for I will no longer have pity on the inhabitants of this land, declares the Lord, because I will cause each of them to fall into the hand of his neighbor and each into the hand of his king, and they shall crush the land, and I will deliver none from their hand. All right? And so I hope I don't need to say this, but it doesn't mean God is taking back any promise that he has ever made or denying any of the prophecy that we've studied. One of the reasons I reviewed so carefully the backdrop of all of this before I started is so that we don't lose the plot. All right? God is doing what God's going to do, but there's still human sin, and there's still a lot of punishment for sin that remains in the world between the time of Zechariah and the time that Jesus comes again to usher in the perfect heavenly Jerusalem. And there are times when God will withhold his forbearance and protection against sinners, and this seems to be such a time. He's said that he wants Zechariah to be the shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter because their own shepherds don't care, and we're come to a period in history where God is not going to extend his protection either. Except God is going to give them Zechariah as a shepherd. Which brings you back to the consideration of how you want to understand that. Is Zechariah really their shepherd? Is he representative of himself and other shepherds? Is he representative of Christ, as many people in the early church tried to read this whole chapter as being about Jesus of Nazareth, which is probably pushing it a little bit. All right. But while God and the other shepherds of the people are not helping them, Zechariah has been given that job. He's standing in the shoes of the one who's been given the job to shepherd the people. And God continues to talk. So in verse 7, Zechariah says, "So I became the shepherd of the flock, doomed to be slaughtered by the sheep traders. And I took 2 staffs, and I named them Favor, and the other I named Union. And I tended the sheep." All right? So God told him to, and Zechariah does become, in some sense, the shepherd of the flock of Israel, which has been described as destined for doom and deserted by its own shepherds. And he has 2 staffs. It says the staff is the stick, the guy in the shepherd in the picture is holding. And I put 2 staffs up in the little blue picture on the right. He's got 2 of them. And I think it's sort of literally hard to think about a sheep farmer or a pig farmer or any kind of farmer walking around with 2 staffs. But it's just one of the reasons why I don't read this literally. This seems to me rather clearly to be symbolic. The staffs are symbolic of powers that he has as a shepherd, been given by God, as the God-appointed shepherd. He has 2 staffs, and he describes them. The Hebrew words are very difficult to translate, evidently, into English. But one of them is favor or blessing, or some people say peace. But one of the staffs has the power of conferring blessing on the people. Okay? And the other staff is translated sometimes bonds or ties, or in this case, union. It has the power to unify and to keep together. Okay? And he has those 2 powers. He has the staff of blessing and the staff of unity. And those are what he has as the God-appointed shepherd of the people. And I just imagine, and this is just me imagining, you can maybe imagine your own way, is that what it means is with the staff of blessing, he can lead the people to water and food and other kinds of blessings that they need in order to survive, and protection and whatnot. And with the other staff, he can do the things like he was talking about in verse 10, to draw the people together and bind the nation together and call people in who've gotten lost and so on. Okay. Which is what God himself and the Son of God and all of the shepherds throughout the Bible, which are foreshadowings or later shadows of the Son of God, the Good Shepherd, do. They bless people and they unify people. They bless people and they unify people. Part of blessing is protecting. Part of unifying is unifying them with himself, the shepherd, and also with other sheep. That's what God's shepherds basically do. And every time there's a God's shepherd, now Zechariah, God is in it. Even if God is saying, it's not my job. He sends his shepherd in there, all right, as when Christ was on earth. He was the one who was given the job by God to be the good shepherd. So Zechariah has taken this role as shepherd of the people. And in verse 8 we read, he says, "In 1 month I destroyed the 3 shepherds, but I became impatient with them, and they also detested me." All right, so remember, part of the problem that the flock has is their own shepherds have no pity on them. All right? And that's why part of the reason why Zechariah is coming. also the thing that God himself has withdrawn in some sense, so that they need to rely on the shepherd which he sent, which happens to be Zechariah within this prophecy right now. And Zechariah says, I did it, and not only that, it wasn't just pretending, I just didn't do it in name only. I actually went in and did stuff. He says in 1 month, and people talk a lot about what does 1 month represent. Everyone agrees it represents a relatively short period of time. Whether it has any additional symbolism, I leave aside in the interest of time. But right away, within 1 month, he says, I destroyed the 3 shepherds. And it's a definite article. It's not 3 shepherds, it's the 3 shepherds, which means those 3 shepherds represent particular, I guess, historical persons. People wonder who. Particular emperors likely, or particular leaders. Anyway, they were people who had been given authority or power, whatever, to rule over God's sheep, because they're called shepherds in this context. And Zechariah destroyed 3 of them, according to the ESV. Some other translations will say dispossessed them or pushed them aside. I don't know that we're supposed to understand that he killed them, but he did away with them. Which is one of the reasons why I think we're right in reading this prophecy as a visionary sort of prophecy rather than as a very literal one, because it is kind of hard to think of 3 shepherds that ruled in Israel during Zechariah's lifetime that he might have destroyed. It doesn't scan really. So I think it's saying that in the somewhat longer term history, 1 month might be, more than 1 month, a century or a few centuries or years or whatever. But in the near future, sort of in a relatively short period of time, the God-appointed shepherd actually put some bad shepherds away. And it says in the latter part of verse 8, he says, I became impatient with them, and they also detested me. And the translators argue about whether I became impatient with them means whether he became impatient with the 3 shepherds, or did he become impatient with the people, the sheep, the flock. I think, having spent some time thinking about this afternoon and reading several different translations and commentaries, most likely it means he's impatient with the flock. He's impatient with the people. He's already destroyed the 3 shepherds. He's impatient with the flock, and more than that, the flock despises him. Okay. People are rejecting the shepherd that God has appointed over them. Right? They and their shepherds maybe despise him and reject him. And so in verse 9 we read, so I said, I will not be your shepherd. What is to die, let it die. What is to be destroyed, let it be destroyed. And let those who are left devour the flesh of one another. Right? So within this vision, he's been made the shepherd of the people. The people have rejected him. And the result is he's saying, yeah, sayonara. Let be what will be. All right. I was looking for a picture of Doris Day to put by K. Sarah, but maybe nobody else is old enough to remember her. All right. So, and that really is what happens here within this sort of prophetic vision. He says, okay, I tried to be the shepherd. I destroyed 3 of the 3 shepherds, but the people despised me. I became impatient with the people. The people are stiff-necked, they're intractable, and so he's going to stop being their shepherd and whatever happens will happen. I always am saying this because I believe this to be true. If the Holy Spirit of God removes itself, people will literally eat one another. If we put us all on a desert island and God removes his spirit, by the time we get hungry, we'll all be trying to kill and eat one another. That's how we are, right? We are not very holy people. We're very sinful people. And when God and his shepherds withdraw, all kind of bad stuff can happen. God doesn't have to stay to do bad things to them. He just has to take a step back, and we'll do bad things to ourselves. Okay. So then in verses 10 and 11, he says, and I took my staff, favor, and I broke it, annulling the covenant that I had made with all the people. So it was annulled on that day, and the sheep traders who were watching me knew that it was the word of the Lord. All right? And just for a modern movie reference that people probably get easily is this is Gandalf breaking the staff of Saruman in The Lord of the Rings, right? Saruman was an evil guy up in a tower with all kinds of power, and when Gandalf came He breaks his staff, and when he breaks his staff, he breaks the power of Saruman. And all the people watching know that the power of Saruman has been broken by the good power of Gandalf, right? It's the same concept here, I think. All right, so the symbol of his withdrawal as their shepherd is he breaks the staff by which he has been conferring blessing on the people. They're no longer in his favor. They reject him. They don't like him. He's resigned as shepherd. All right, and this doesn't mean that any of the promises God made or any of the prophecies that we've studied so far are by any means compromised or taken away. What God has said will happen will happen. But the work of this shepherd is at an end here in the sight of the people. All right, and that's symbolized by the breaking of this, one of the two staffs that he had, that he was shepherding the people with. They're no longer under God's protection and blessing because they've rejected the shepherd who God sent, who had the staff of protection and blessing. They're naked now in the world, and whatever happens will happen. God has let them alone for a while to see what happens. God's going to let them wander beyond his protection in some sense. All right. And not only that, I think it's important to notice here, it says, and the sheep traders who were watching me knew that it was the word of the Lord, which means that the withdrawal of the power and protection of God from the people is somehow seen by the enemies of the people. It's perceived that they don't enjoy the Lord's protection right now, which is part of their downfall also. I almost am tempted to see a sort of spiritual warfare sort of thing here where, like, all the forces of evil can perceive that God's power has been withdrawn for a time, and so now they're at risk to any kind of evil that wants to come get them. But it might not be quite that spectacular. I don't know. And then in verses 12 and 13, we read, it says, "Then I said to them, if it seems good to you, give me my wages. But if not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. And then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter." All right. So the significance here is probably pretty easy to understand. Zechariah has been their shepherd. He's been blessing them and protecting them, unifying them. Now they've said that they don't want him, and he's withdrawn. And he says to them, and of course this is symbolic, right? It's really strange if you took it literally. He says to them, okay, I've been your shepherd for a time and you've rejected me. Please pay me. So it says they measure out 30 pieces of silver. This was, I understand, reckoned to be the price of a slave. So the 30 pieces of silver is sort of like saying, okay, you're quits as our shepherd now, we'll pay you as if you were our slave. All right. In any case, 30 pieces of silver is understood to be a ridiculously small amount of money, so that paying him 30 pieces of silver as a retiring shepherd of the people is worse than paying him nothing. It's an intentional insult, a continuation of their disrespect for God and his shepherd. And so God says to him, don't take that, just give it away. And so he gives it, he throws it to the potter, and throwing money to the potter is evidently a proverbial saying in those days that we've lost track of the meaning or the history of, but it sort of means just, give it to the poor or throw it to some obscure place. And evidently the potter worked in the house of the Lord, and so he says he went to the house of the Lord and threw this paltry amount of money. And God is obviously being ironical when he says here, the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. As God is not serious. God is saying, look at how they're dissing us, right? They're disrespecting us. Give the money to the potter and let's get out of here. Right? And so God's shepherd has been dismissed and disrespected and disregarded, and the people have laid themselves open to all kinds of risks that come from that. And in the New Testament, this image, as you probably all were thinking to yourselves, is remembered. Matthew remembers that the chief priests and elders paid 30 pieces of silver to Judas Iscariot as the price for them to betray Jesus. And according to Matthew, Judas later felt guilty and changed his mind, and he went back to give the 30 pieces of silver back to the priests and the elders. And so when Matthew saw that happen, he made the connection, I believe, to the prophecy that we're studying tonight. And Matthew then says in Matthew 27, chapter 9, that this was in fulfillment of prophecy when Judas took the 30 pieces of silver and gave it back. Matthew saw that as a fulfillment of the prophecy that we're studying. Interestingly, Matthew remembers this as being a prophecy of Jeremiah. And there is no such prophecy in Jeremiah. It's in Zechariah. So people have really strained over the years to try to reconcile Matthew's memory with Old Testament prophecy. And Martin Luther and other people said, Matthew just forgot which prophet said it, which seems plausible to me. But if that bothers you, there may be some other way to reconcile that. What Matthew realized was that what happened with Judas and Jesus was almost precisely the same thing that the prophet Zechariah had seen, more than 500 years, almost 600 years earlier. One of the shepherds being disrespected by the people who rejected him, and Jesus was the good shepherd being disrespected by the people who rejected him. The symbolic link is really interesting and strong. So now that he's been disrespected twice, once by being sent away, and twice by being given this ridiculous price in return, we read in verse 14, another symbolic act. Then I broke my second staff, union, annulling the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. Right? And so again, we have this symbolic gesture of breaking a staff as the breaking of the power associated with the staff. Remember, his second staff was the power to unify, of union, to keep the nation together. And so now the shepherd is gone, the protection and blessing is gone, and the power that unifies the people is gone. So they're sort of at the mercy of all the forces of entropy that rule the world. They're going to have a bad few centuries, coming up, it looks like, if we read here, chapter 11, right? Without a good shepherd, the people are going to be really wretched and divided. And it's really worse than that, because if the people won't have a good shepherd that God sends them, then they're going to have a bad shepherd, and that's always what happens. So Zechariah was first instructed by God to be the shepherd of the flock in, as I think, a kind of symbolic, visionary sort of a way, because their own shepherds didn't care for them and so forth and so on, as we've been discussing, and that didn't work. We've seen how that worked. They rejected the good shepherd and all that went with it. So now God instructs him in verse 15 to become a different shepherd, and this is part of the reason why I don't think we're looking at literal stuff, but rather symbolic stuff, because God will never instruct his prophet to become a bad shepherd, really. Okay. So verse 15 through 17 read, the Lord said to me, take once more the equipment of a foolish shepherd, for behold, I am raising up in the land a shepherd who does not care for those being destroyed, or seek the young, or heal the maimed, or nourish the healthy, but devours the flesh of the fat ones, tearing off even their hooves. Woe to my worthless shepherd who deserts the flock. May the sword strike his arm, and his right eye, let his arm be wholly withered, his right eye utterly blinded. All right, so God is asking now Zechariah to sort of represent a bad shepherd. First, he represented the good shepherd, perhaps all good shepherds who are rejected by the people. Now he represents the bad shepherd, perhaps all bad shepherds, which the people have instead of the good ones they reject. And the Lord says to him, be this foolish shepherd, and he's described the foolish shepherd as really not caring about the sheep at all, but rather being the one who will chiefly victimize them. And it's hard to know exactly which bad shepherd is in mind here, in the mind of God or in the mind of Zechariah. There are between 500 and, I don't know exactly what time it would be now that Zechariah is talking. It's later than 518 BC. It might be just shortly before, after the temple was rebuilt. But already the voice of the prophet is saying, yeah, we'll rebuild the temple. Yeah, things will build up. Yeah, there's a great future. But there's really hard times coming. And God has tried to send you good shepherds and you reject them. By the way, he's going to send you his son, the good shepherd, that swallows up all other shepherds, and you'll reject him. Because you reject the good shepherd, you'll have a bad one, and you'll suffer for it. And this is a picture of Titus, who tore down the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. There's never been a temple after that. Certainly there have been a lot of bad shepherds appointed over Israel. And many people understand that when Titus tore down the temple in 70 AD, there was a more or less direct relationship between the crucifixion of Christ, the rejection of God's own Son, and the destruction of the city of David and the temple in Jerusalem. And so what we read in Zechariah chapter 11, whether this is just a coincidence or a real connection, I can't be certain, fits nicely into what actually happens in history, is that God does send the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd is rejected by his people, crucified on the cross. For the most part, not accepted as who he was, except for the several thousand Jewish Christians that grow up after Christ is risen. But because the people rejected their Messiah, all manner of bad things happened to them, including this guy Titus, who pulled down the city and the temple in 70 AD, and many other bad things besides. So that's chapter 11 and the conclusion of the first main oracle of the second half of Zechariah. And again, I just am suggesting to you that you read it against the backdrop of the large future, past and present history of God that's laid out in the first 8 chapters, realizing as you do that from the time of Zechariah until the time when Jesus comes again to usher in that perfect kingdom, there's a lot of history that goes by. And a lot of the history the Jews will go through is this rough kind of history that we see in chapter 11, which means the prophecy is not surprised that sin is still in the kingdom, that good shepherds are still being rejected, and that bad shepherds rule as a result. Any questions? What's my opinion?
Yeah, so that there have been many people saying different things, trying to reconcile who might make a mistake or what.
Well, okay, I'll tell you my opinion. Turn off the video. Just curious. The reason why people get nervous about that is because they have a very high view of the accuracy and authority and inspiration of Scripture. And I also have a very high view of Scripture. So I believe that it's the inspired Word of God. I believe it's sufficient for all the things that we need. I believe that God never makes a mistake, and that it's possible with the help of the Holy Spirit to understand the things that God wants to speak to us through the Bible. All that's true. It's also true that in translating the Bible out of original languages over many centuries, people make mistakes. We have all of the manuscripts. We can lay them side by side. We can analyze it with computer. The manuscripts are phenomenally in agreement with one another, but they're not identical. Right? So people didn't have computers. They didn't have, internet. They didn't have even printing presses. Right? They're copying all this stuff by hand for a long, long time. It's just amazing to me that we have the Bible that we have, and it's so consistent with itself and so good. And yet, I think it would be strange to deny that we do see copying errors and translation issues and stuff like that. And old men don't always remember what Old Testament prophet they're quoting from. It's not just me. Martin Luther and John Calvin especially, because they studied the Bible a lot, and nobody ever accused them of being unorthodox, clearly could recognize that sometimes New Testament apostles are really kind of casual in how they remember Old Testament prophets. They remember the idea. They remember the point. They understand it a lot better than we do, because they're that much closer to God than we are, but it doesn't mean that they can verbatim, off the top of their memory, remember what was quoted by Jeremiah or Zechariah, one of those Old Testament prophets, whether in the Greek version or the Hebrew version or this manuscript or that manuscript. And so my opinion is it doesn't scare me at all to say that Matthew could have just remembered the wrong prophet. I don't think it subtracts from the authority of the Bible. But if you happen to be a person who has a more verbal inspiration idea about the Bible, I don't think God dictated the Bible like through a robot, right? If that were true, then everything would have to be perfect because God is perfect. But God inspired human beings to understand and to write and to read and to understand. And so to me, when I see something like that, it just makes me believe the Bible more because I know that people haven't been playing around with the Bible to sort of artificially harmonize it. Right? People are afraid to do that. For centuries, the Jews wouldn't even change, a punctuation mark without deep study and debate, right? I mean, people don't want to fool around with the Word of God. And so I think it's okay to think he made a mistake. The other possibility that Luther said is that it might have been, a copyist might have made the mistake rather than Matthew. That's less likely because we have a lot of different manuscripts we can look at, and it seems like the mistake was repeated. But anyway, I don't know. Or maybe the way people have tried to reconcile it is to say that Matthew's understanding of Jeremiah was so much deeper than ours that when he says that it goes back to Jeremiah, that's true in ways that we just don't have documents to support. That's the kind of way people have tried to harmonize it. It's okay, what?
Is there a possibility that they have literature that now we don't have access to?
Surely they did. but the Old Testament that Matthew had and the Old Testament that you and I have are rather the same thing. So that's the amazing thing. I mean, Jesus grew up reading the same Bible that we're studying now. And Jesus had a thing or two to say about the authority of Old Testament Scripture and its importance. And so, I mean, the Son of God himself is saying that the Old Testament is all about me. Right? I don't know. I mean, I have a computer in my office so I can look stuff up really easily. Even so, sometimes if I'm preparing for class, I know it's somewhere in the Old Testament, but I might say the wrong place. Right? Just because I didn't have time to look it up. And I don't think they probably didn't have copies of the Bible laying around like we do either. You had to go find one and look it up. So. Does anybody else have a different understanding or want to correct what I said? I know some people are really nervous about that, but I'm not. Okay, let's pray. Dear God, we're so very, very thankful that you're a God who speaks to his people, and that despite the fact you're talking about things which are of cosmic significance, the past and the present and the future of the universe, your plans for your people, and so many other things, you actually take the time and you bend down very low to explain these things in words and concepts that we have a chance to understand as human beings. You might be a different kind of a God, and we thank you that you're the kind of God that you are. Because you've given us this privilege and this blessing to have your word in the Bible, we do always pray that you will protect us from mistakes in our understanding. We know that not only are we fallible human beings, but also we're sinful human beings, and that Satan will try to confuse us if ever he can. And so we ask always that you protect us from any sinful or even just accidental misunderstanding of your word. We know often there are mistakes made in my teaching. I can see them almost every week. When that happens, Lord, please don't let people remember the things where I'm wrong, but help them to remember the things that you really wanted to say to them on the night that they heard it. Don't let me be the teacher, but you be the teacher through the words that are in the Bible for everyone to see. Still, I hope, Lord, the time that we spend here is not wasted, and that people can pick up some help in understanding the Bible, to being together and reading it together as we do. And not just that we'll understand, but that it will change us so that we'll become more and more like Jesus through the time that we spend reading your word. Please help everybody to get home safely tonight, and if it's your will to come back safely next Tuesday night, we'll continue reading where we left off. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.